In the autumn of 1956, a retired railroad clerk in Davenport, Iowa, walked into the same diner every Tuesday morning at 7:15. He had buried his wife the year before. He lived alone in a two-bedroom house on Brady Street. By the spring of 1957, he had 11 friends he had not known the previous October. He had not joined a club. He had not answered an ad. He had used a set of habits his father had drilled into him in 1909, and those habits had done all of the work for him. He died in 1971. Every one of those 11 men was a pallbearer. This was how senior men in the 1950s stayed alive. Not the medicine, not the pension, the habits, the 1,000 small disciplines they had been taught before they turned 20, the ones that turned a counter stool into a friendship and a sidewalk nod into a standing invitation. We threw those habits away inside of 2 generations. We told men that being alone was their own fault, that loneliness was a mental health crisis, that they should download an application. 1 in 3 American men over 50 now reports no close friends at all. Their fathers would have called that an emergency. We call it Tuesday. Number 22 on this list took less than 4 seconds and turned a stranger at a lunch counter into a man who saved a seat for you the following week. Number 14 directly contradicts every piece of modern advice given to lonely seniors, and the men who practiced it in 1955 had more friends in their 70s than most Americans have at any age. And number 3, the habit that quietly built more late-life friendships in working-class America than any other single behavior was so plain that nobody ever bothered to name it. These 30 habits were not about being clever, they were about being decent. They were the difference between a widower who disappeared inside his own house and a widower who walked out of his front door every morning and found the world waiting for him. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 30 lost 1950s charm habits senior men living alone need to remember to make friends again. Number 30, the same stool, same time. You picked 1 counter, 1 diner, 1 stool, and you arrived at the same hour every day. By the end of the 2nd week, the waitress poured the coffee before you sat down. By the end of the 4th, the other regulars nodded when you came in. The stool became your address. A man who showed up was a man who could be counted on. Loneliness has always lost to consistency. Number 29. Tip in coins, not bills, quarters, dimes, stacked neatly beside the saucer. The waitress saw the care in the stacking before she saw the amount. For a retired millwright in Akron in 1956, the coin tip was a small daily ceremony of respect. Bills said, "I am paying you." Coins said, "I noticed you." The waitress noticed back. Number 28. Read the paper folded in quarters, never spread it out across the counter, folded small on the corner of the saucer, out of the way of the next man's elbow. The folded paper was an open chair. It said the seat beside you was for company. The spread paper was a wall. Senior men in the 50s knew the difference between solitude and a fortress. Number 27th. Comment on the weather first. Not as small talk, but as a doorway. The weather was the one subject every American shared. For a widower in St. Paul in 1954, the weather line to the man on the next stool was the entire opening. 2 minutes later, they were talking about the World Series. 20 minutes later, they were friends. The weather was never about the weather. Number 26. Ask about his work. Even if he was retired, especially if he was retired. Ask, "What did you do? What kind of work was that?" The retired man's whole life was in the answer. For a former bricklayer in Pittsburgh in 1957, asking the man beside him what he had done for 40 years was the kindest thing one stranger could do for another. Modern conversation asks, "How are you?" 1950 asked, "What did you build?" Number 25. The handshake on the way out. Not when you sat down. When you stood up to leave, you turned to the man you had been talking to, offered your hand, said good to meet you, and used his name. For a retired sheet metal worker in Cleveland in 1955, the parting handshake was the whole promise. It said, "I will be back." It said, "You are now somebody I know." The hand at the end mattered more than the hand at the beginning. Number 24. Carry a clean handkerchief, white cotton, folded, ironed in the breast pocket, not for show, but for use, to offer to a woman whose eyes have watered, to a child who has spilled, to a man who has cut his thumb. For a Polish widower in Buffalo in 1953, the handkerchief was the single most reliable friendship tool he carried. A man who could produce a clean handkerchief at the right moment had announced that he had been raised. Number 23. Stand up when a lady approaches the counter. Even if you were 80, even if your knees hurt. The half rise was enough. The gesture said, "I see you." For a Tennessee retiree in 1958 at a Knoxville lunch counter, the small standing was the lesson his grandfather had given him before 1900. The women noticed. The men around him noticed harder. He was invited to 3 suppers that month. Number 22. The 4-second eye hold. When a man spoke to you, you held his eyes for 4 seconds before you spoke back. Not a stare, a pause. It told him you had heard him. For a retired postman in Springfield in 1956, the 4-second hold was the only listening trick he had ever needed. Men told him things they had not told their own wives. He had no method. He had attention. Attention has always been the rarest thing one man can give another. Number 21. Compliment the cook, not the food. The cook. Tell the waitress to tell whoever made the meatloaf that it was the best he had eaten that year. Specific, earnest, quiet. For a former Navy man in Norfolk in 1954, the compliment carried back to the kitchen and built a friendship with a man he had never met. The cook came out one Saturday to shake his hand. They were friends for 9 years. Here is what nobody tells senior men anymore. Loneliness did not happen to you. It was built around you. The diner counter closed. The lunch counter at the drugstore closed. The barber shop where 4 men sat all morning closed. The fraternal lodge closed. The corner store where the old man kept a chair by the register closed. Every architectural space the 1950s had built for senior men to gather in has been quietly removed, one by one, across 50 years, and replaced with a drive-through window and a screen. The habits on this list do not require those spaces to come back. They require a single man willing to show up at the same place at the same hour, to begin rebuilding a small public life, 1 cup of coffee at a time. The 50s man did not have an app. He had a stool. The stool is still out there. It is waiting for someone to sit on it again. Number 20. Remember one detail and bring it back next week. The man at the counter mentioned his daughter was getting married in June. The following Tuesday, you asked how the wedding plans were coming. That was the whole trick. For an Indiana retiree in 1957, the carried detail was the difference between an acquaintance and a friend. He kept a small notebook at home. He wrote one fact about each man after each conversation. By the end of the year, the notebook had 90 names. He died at the counter of his diner in 1973, and every name in the notebook came to the wake. Number 19. Hold the door an extra beat. Not for the person right behind you, but for the one 10 feet back. You waited the extra 3 seconds. You held the door. For an old Methodist in Wichita in 1955, the held door was the smallest possible kindness a man could offer in public, and the one most reliably remembered. The person who had been waited for never forgot the man who had waited. Number 18. Sit beside the other man, not across. When a stranger sat at the counter, you slid one stool over so the next arrival had a seat near you, not opposite you. Side by side meant conversation. Across meant interrogation. For a retired conductor in St. Louis in 1956, the geometry of the counter was a friendship technology. Men who sat side by side spoke about their lives. Men who sat across spoke about the menu. Number 17. Pay for the coffee of the stranger. Quietly, pay it to the waitress before you leave. The stranger looked up. The waitress nodded toward the door. You were already gone. For a widower in Rochester in 1954, the prepaid coffee for a man he had spoken to for 10 minutes was an investment that returned for the rest of his life. The stranger asked the waitress his name. The stranger came back the next morning. They drank coffee together for 16 years. Number 16. Tell the joke on yourself, not on others, never on others. The senior man's humor was always at his own expense. The forgotten word, the missed train, the lost key. For a former machinist in Toledo in 1956, the self-deprecating joke at the counter every morning was the entire welcome mat. Other men laughed. Then they offered their own. A man who could laugh at himself was a man who would not laugh at them. Number 15. Ask about his people. Where are you from originally? Where did your father work? Where did your mother's people settle? For an Italian retiree in Providence in 1955, the question about people was the lock and the key. Every man at the counter had people. To ask was to honor them. To answer was to be honored. The conversation that began with people never ended quickly. Number 14. Refuse to complain about your health. Not at the counter, not in public, not to friends. The body was a private matter. To complain about it was to ask the other man to carry weight that was not his. For an old farmer in Lincoln in 1957, the rule was iron. He had 3 diseases. He never mentioned one of them. The men around him called him good company. Good company has always been the man who left his troubles at the door. Number 13. The handwritten note. When a man at the counter mentioned a wife in the hospital, a son shipping out, a mother in her last days, you went home and wrote a note. 3 sentences, pencil. You walked it over to his house that evening, or mailed it the next morning. For a retired schoolteacher in 1956, the handwritten note was the single most powerful friendship instrument he ever used. The men who received those notes kept them for the rest of their lives. Some of them were found decades later in shoeboxes their widows could not bring themselves to throw away. Number 12. Show up to the funeral, every one. Even the ones you could skip, even the ones where you barely knew the man. You put on the dark suit, you sat in the back, you signed the book, you shook the widow's hand. For an old plumber in Camden in 1958, the rule was the keystone of his late-life friendships. Every funeral he attended built a relationship with 3 other men he had not previously known. He showed up. They remembered. The room got smaller. The friendships got bigger. In 1953, a sociology graduate student at the University of Chicago surveyed the social networks of retired men in 3 working-class neighborhoods. He expected the loneliness rate to be high. He found the opposite. The average retired man in his sample reported between 9 and 14 men he could call a close friend. They had not met those men in clubs. They had not met them through family. They had met them at lunch counters, on park benches, at barbershops, and at union halls. The mechanism was always the same. Repeated presence in a public space, plus the small habits on this list, equaled a friendship inside 3 months. The study sat in the archives at Chicago for 60 years. The grandsons of the men in that survey now report, on average, less than 1 close friend each. The variable that changed was not the men. The variable was the habits. Number 11. Carry change for the phone. A pocket full of nickels, dimes, and quarters, not for yourself, but for the man who needed to make a call and did not have the coins. For a retired bus driver in Omaha in 1956, the pocket change was a public service nobody had asked him to provide. He gave away maybe $1 a week. The men he handed coins to remembered him for years. Number 10. The slow sip. When you got your coffee, you did not drink it. You let it sit. You watched the steam. You took the first sip after a full minute. The pace told the room you were not in a hurry to leave. For a widower in Birmingham in 1957, the slow sip was the daily declaration that he had arrived to stay, not to refuel. Men who sit quickly leave quickly. The counter knew the difference. Number 9. Ask the waitress's name. Once. On the first day. You used it every day after for the rest of your life. For a retired electrician in Hartford in 1955, the waitress at his diner was named Eileen. He used her name every morning for 19 years. When he died, Eileen brought the casserole to his house before any of his nieces did. The name was the whole bridge. Number 8. Bring the newspaper to share. Not your own paper, a second one. You bought 2 and left one folded on the counter for whoever sat down next. For an old foreman in Youngstown in 1958, the shared paper was an offering. Whoever picked it up started a conversation. The 2-cent investment returned in friendships for a decade. Number 7. Ask permission before sitting down. Even at a public counter, even at a park bench. Mind if I sit here? The question was a formality. The answer was always yes. The asking was the whole point. For a retired carpenter in Spokane in 1956, the permission was the door he opened 1,000 times. Men remembered being asked. Men did not remember being joined uninvited. Number 6. Walk slow past the park bench. When you passed a man sitting alone on a bench, you slowed down, you nodded, you said good morning. You did not stop unless invited. The slowing was the offer. The other man's eyes were the answer. For a Polish widower in Milwaukee in 1954, the slow walk past the benches in Mitchell Park was his daily friendship harvest. 3 days out of 7, somebody invited him to sit. He sat. He stayed. He came back. Number 5. Refuse to be the first to leave. When the conversation at the counter was good, you stayed, even past the time you had planned, even when your coffee was cold. The man who left first ended the morning. The man who stayed last carried it. For an old railroad supervisor in Cheyenne in 1957, the rule was simple. The friendship was built in the last 10 minutes, not the first 10. The men who left early never knew what they had missed. Number 4. Remember the birthday. One man, one date. You wrote it on the calendar in the kitchen. When it came around, you walked into the diner with a small thing, a cigar, a card, a handshake, and a sentence. For a widower in Salem in 1956, remembering Carl's 70th birthday was the gesture he mentioned in his own eulogy 9 years later. The small thing was the whole thing. Number 3, say his name every time you see him. Good morning, Frank. See you tomorrow, Frank. How is the back today, Frank? The name in every exchange. For a retired butcher in Scranton in 1955, the rule was the cheapest friendship technology ever invented and the most consistently effective. Men whose names were spoken aloud felt seen. Men who felt seen came back. The whole machinery of working-class friendship in 1950 ran on the spoken name. Number 2, show up when you said you would. If you told a man you would meet him at the diner at 8, you were there at 7:55 every time for 30 years. For a former Union steward in Allentown in 1958, the rule was the entire foundation. Showing up was the promise. The promise kept was the friendship. The men who showed up were the men with friends. The men who did not were not. The math has never been more complicated than that. Number 1, go. That is the whole rule. Put on your coat, walk out the door, sit at the counter, order the coffee, stay an hour, do it tomorrow, do it the day after, do it every morning for the rest of your life. For a widower in any town in 1955, America, the entire friendship system began with the willingness to leave the house. No technique mattered if you stayed home. No charm worked from the kitchen table. The most important habit on this list was the smallest one. You went. You sat down. You stayed long enough to be recognized. Everything else on this list was decoration on a doorway you had already walked through. None of these habits required money. None required a class, an application, a coach, or a single dollar spent on instruction. They required a coat, a counter, and the willingness to show up at the same hour every day until the room knew your face. The handkerchief in the pocket. The slow sip. The name spoken aloud. The handshake on the way out. The note delivered by hand. The funeral attended in the back row. These were not the habits of phonies. These were the habits of decent men who understood that loneliness was not a feeling, it was a consequence. The consequence of habits not practiced. The consequence of doors not opened. The consequence of stools left empty. The widower in Davenport in 1956 did not have a secret. He had a stool, he sat on it, he stayed. The stool is still out there. The coat is still in the closet. The door is still on the hinges. Every senior man in America who has ever wondered why the phone does not ring already knows what the men in this script knew. The phone does not ring for the man who has not yet walked out his front door.